So a growing number of Canadians are becoming increasingly skeptical of science and increasingly likely to view science and scientists as quote-unquote elitists. And this is some pretty troubling stuff, I have to say. And I don't think this applies just to scientists, but really, academics in general, be they in the sciences or in the humanities or social sciences. I think there's a growing feeling from people that academics are out of touch, are inaccessible, they're in the ivory tower, and that their viewpoints aren't, based on fact necessarily, but that are, crafted for certain narratives. And so this is where this growing skepticism of science and academic work comes from. Now, there are two major causes for this, and I think the first one is by far the biggest, but I want to get into the second one because I don't think everybody who expresses these emotions is doing so from a rabidly anti-intellectual position. But the first point is, and has to be said, that conservative voices, right-of-center voices, over the past couple decades at least, have been taking an anti-science, anti-academic, anti-intellectual position. Because increasingly, their positions are in direct contradiction with academic consensus. Whether it's social positions or economic positions or cultural positions or positions on things like healthcare or, safety or immigration, whether on the social sciences or humanities, of course, the biggest one, perhaps the biggest one being climate change, the right of center viewpoint is incompatible with the basic facts and analysis we have, the qualitative and quantitative data. And so you can either change your views to become more compatible with the science, or you can denounce the science and you can say it's wrong, or you can say it's more complicated than that, or you can say that they haven't factored in all the variables. And this is where right-wing climate change denial comes from. And this is where right-wing insistence that guns can't be the problem comes from. And this is where right-wing rejection of basic historical facts often comes from. This is where right-wing rejection of, for instance, paleontology and of broad human history in terms of our archaeological record comes from. It's that the science is biased, the science is flawed, the scientists have an agenda, and the agenda is anti-people like you and me. And that's the argument, right? And so that is one of the reasons why we're seeing this rise in anti-intellectualism. That there are some people out there who increasingly see highly educated people like scientists as, having an agenda and using their credentials and using their position to push an agenda that is wrong and that is biased. So for instance, it's not just that this person has, a disagreement with a scientist who claims that, the Earth is older than 5,000 years, or that, climate change is probably real. It's that those scientists are part of a quote-unquote liberal or socialist elite whose goal is to indoctrinate you and your children and other people's children to build a liberal utopia in which conservative voices will be demonized. And this ties in to this narrative, which I don't think is true at all, that universities are not safe spaces for conservatives, that conservatives can't have opinions on universities, that conservatives are being silenced on universities, and that they don't have free speech. And it even ties into that video I made last week about how Andrew Scheer and the conservatives are feeding into this narrative that professors are teaching you left-wing talking points. And only the Conservative Party will represent those students who are, free-thinking enough to reject the left-wing professors and come over and hear the real truth of the Conservative Party and of conservative ideology. So I don't want to discount all of that. I think that's incredibly important. I think that as long as there's political or economic gain to be made by certain forces in taking an anti-science or anti-intellectual position, they will continue to do so. And so, for instance, it won't go away. As long as there are people who want to profit off fossil fuels, even though they are leading us towards climate catastrophe, there will be folks who will take a position that the climate science is fakery, or it's wrong, or it's alarmist, or what have you. They will do that because that will make them money, either because other people who deny the science will fund their Patreons or things like that, or because they get shadow money and dark money from big billionaire donors, Coke industry people, PragerU people. If you want to make a lot of money in this world, then you could take an anti-science position that happens to serve corporate interests. Simple as that. You can say, I don't support climate change. I think it's a hoax. And maybe somebody will pay you many, many, many thousands of dollars, if not more, to say that. But I think that this piece notes a couple key factors. Many scientists acknowledge the flaws of their outreach. And I think this can apply to other academics who aren't, quote unquote scientists. I think that there's a growing sense that academia is, inaccessible, whether it's cost-based or whether it's that, the research is increasingly arcane and hard to read. Sometimes it's literally impossible to access because it's behind paywalls, things like that. The reality is that a lot of people feel disconnected from the work academics do because most academics don't necessarily do enough to share why their research matters to regular people, right? To policymakers and to regular people. And this is one of the things I've tried to do as a historian, very traditionally trained, have a PhD, did the dissertation, all of the inaccessibility of that work acknowledged. I and many others, scientists, historians, have done our best to bring these ideas to people and explain to them in short pieces, trying to limit dense footnotes, trying to limit language that's hard to read and understand and terminology that you need to be an expert on to understand. And in so doing, explain to people, here's why this history matters. Here's why it's relevant today. Here's why it's interesting today. Here's what it could tell us about the challenges we face today. Here's a lesson people learned back in the day that maybe we need to heed. Or here is a lesson they didn't learn, and maybe we'll be lucky enough to learn it and not repeat the same mistakes they did. And these are all things that, depending on your academic discipline, you can make contributions for. And I think that that's something that academics need to do more of. Scientists need to do more of. Because here's the thing, if people feel you're inaccessible and they don't know much about what you do and they don't know the relevance of what you're doing, it's a heck of a lot easier for disingenuous and cynical people to paint you as elitist and to paint your work as irrelevant or to paint your work as agenda-driven and on and on and on. Because if people don't know who you are and they don't really have a sense of what a historian or what a scientist does or looks like or the context of their work. But there is one point here that I do think we need to emphasize. The research notes that about 42% of people see scientists as elitists, and about a third of people see science as driven by government and or corporate agendas. And I don't necessarily think those last two parts are wrong. Now, I'm not suggesting that need fill people with an anti-intellectual mentality, but it is not inaccurate to say that funding agencies, be they private or public, do shape how scholars, pitch research, conduct research, report on their research. It's a simple fact. Whether subconsciously or consciously, the way in which research is funded does affect research. Sometimes it's not even the specific work. It might not be the case that, a scientist is tweaking their data to serve their corporate master. That, they've been hired by, a tire company to do research to prove that this company's tires are safe. They find out that the tires are actually quite dangerous, and then they lie to people. I'm not necessarily suggesting that's the case. What I am suggesting, however, is that there is a lot of important research out there that may not get funded unless a capitalist or a corporation sees that research as valuable. And they might be doing it for very specific aims that aren't driven by the pursuit of truth and knowledge, but by corporate profits and private profits. And so for some people to suggest that, yes, science is increasingly driven by desires and ambitions that are not purely scientific is true. And I don't necessarily blame government agencies nearly as much as corporate agencies, but as has been noted by others, increasingly government funding agencies have been including corporate voices on the decision process about which scientific projects at universities get funded or don't get funded. Almost as if to say that we're bringing in non-scientific voices or non-academic voices to drive our research in more corporate-friendly or corporate-relevant directions. So, in a sense, there are some things that are making it easier for people to dismiss the value and neutrality of science. I think some people reject it because science isn't accessible, because we haven't done a good enough job as a society to teach people what science is and what it isn't, the scientific method, things like that. And people from academia haven't done a good enough job to actually explain to people what we do in a way that they can understand. It's as simple as that. But it has to also be said that we need to challenge corporate power over the scientific process. Again, I'm not accusing any particular scientist or project of being irreparably, distorted by corporate influence. But what I am saying is that as long as people think that science is less a mechanism for truth and accuracy and more a mechanism to help companies make money, then people will always be able to make that connection, that the science is driven in part by a desire to deceive you or to manipulate you for someone else's profit. And it's sort of ironic because the right-wing science is that. Like their climate denial science is that. They will do science, quote unquote. They might do research. They might have data. But it's very clearly done to drive a point home that climate change is either not real or not human caused or much less impactful than we think or what have you. And that science, quote unquote, is being done. So I think at the end of the day, we need to realize that yes, it's bad increasing amounts of regular people are seeing science and scientists as elitist. And they're seeing it as agenda-driven rather than as, the pursuit of academic knowledge. That's bad. And it is driven in part by right-wing anti-intellectuals. But we have to also realize that if we continue to allow corporate influence within the scientific process, both within and beyond the university, and if we continue to fail to be accessible to people who want to know more about us, we will continue to see, regular people view academics, view scientists as out of touch and agenda driven. And again, this research notes this. This piece has a silver lining, I think, where, a vast majority of people know science is important and want to learn more about it. And so there has to be mechanisms there through the public education system, but also through popular culture to get science to the people in a way that is accessible and honest. Because what's at stake is the continued assault on anything that is quote unquote intellectual, that challenges, right of center views on social or political or scientific issues.